Story 1. My girlfriend and I had just moved into our new house. It was honestly everything we'd been dreaming of. The perfect place for the two of us. We even had a cat named Bella that we'd rescued together. So when we first settled in, everything felt just right. The only drawback at the start was the house sitting directly to our right. It looked completely abandoned. The previous owner had begun some kind of renovation project, but never saw it through. The layout of our property is a bit unusual. On the right side of our house, there's an access point leading into our back garden, and right next to it is a similar entrance to the abandoned house's back garden. There was no fence dividing the two spaces. The original owner had torn it down to put up a new one, but never followed through, which meant both gardens were essentially open to anyone who wanted to walk in. Behind the abandoned property was another house, separated by a fence. From what we could see, a group of young men were living there. Every so often, when we came home, we'd notice them cutting through the abandoned garden to get to the front of the street. We didn't pay it much attention in the beginning. Maybe they knew the owner. Maybe they had some kind of permission. We gave them the benefit of the doubt. Then came our first night in the new place. We were sitting out in the back garden, enjoying the space, just taking everything in. Out of curiosity, we glanced up at the houses behind us. And that's when we spotted a man in one of the windows. He was staring directly at us. Not glancing, not peeking. Staring. Completely blank-faced, with no attempt to hide it. The room behind him was dark, which made the whole scene feel deeply unsettling. We told ourselves he was probably just curious about the new neighbors, but after 30 minutes of that same expressionless stare, we decided to head back inside. The next few days were uneventful. I went to work, my girlfriend continued unpacking, and things felt pretty normal. Then one evening, we decided to sit out in the garden again. It was dark, but we liked looking up at the stars and just talking. That was until we heard the makeshift wooden board that was acting as part of the fence being shoved aside. 3 men stepped through the gap and stood there, staring at us. I asked if everything was all right, knowing they weren't going to leave unless someone said something. The youngest of the 3, who looked to be around 29, was holding a large bag. We had no idea what was inside. He proceeded to offer us some stolen dish soap tablets, which we turned down. I made a lighthearted comment to ease the tension. He smiled, said okay, and the 3 of them left. What stayed with me was the way they just walked into our garden without a word. Like it was completely normal. Like they had every right to be there. We went back inside thinking it was a one-time thing. But from that point on, things only got worse. They began showing up in our garden more frequently, and their behavior started to feel deliberately threatening. They'd get into the neighboring property by lifting the fence panel that divided the back gardens and walking straight through. I should mention, my girlfriend and I are both 20 years old. So naturally, the thought that these men might be trying to intimidate 2 young women was one of the first things that entered our minds. One afternoon, while I was tidying up the front room, 2 police officers came around the side of our house and walked into the abandoned garden. They lifted the fence, looked around for a few minutes, and then left without saying a word to us. I thought it was odd, but went on with my day, assuming it probably meant the people next door were known troublemakers. A few days after that, the police knocked on our front door. They told us the house behind ours was now empty. The men had been evicted for antisocial behavior, and apparently, it wasn't just us they'd been causing problems for. Other neighbors had reported them too. Honestly, we felt an enormous wave of relief. Even though nothing had physically happened to us yet, at least now they wouldn't get the chance to push things further. We carried on settling into the house, but then one day, while I was in the bath, I heard a loud bang coming from outside. I got dressed as quickly as I could and went to find my girlfriend. I found her in the spare bedroom, filming something through the window that overlooks the garden of what was now an empty house. I asked what was going on, and she hushed me. After a moment, she explained what she'd seen. A man she had never seen before had pointed up at our bedroom window. When he realized she'd spotted him, he broke into a full sprint directly toward our house. He grabbed our door handle as he ran past, tried it, then turned back, threw the broken fence aside, and started pounding on every window of the empty property. We called the police immediately. They arrived, reviewed the footage, took our statement, and left. We were shaken. Why would someone try our door handle and then break into an empty house? What had he been planning? A few nights later, while we were lying in bed, we heard whistling, the kind of whistle men use to taunt women. It was just after 2 a.m. We stayed quiet and listened, and then came the tapping. Someone was tapping on our window. Terrified, we checked the security cameras, but for some reason nothing had been recorded. Whoever it was must have moved on fairly quickly because the sound stopped. But neither of us could sleep. The next day we drove to my mom's and stayed the night there. When we came home the following morning, we noticed our Ring doorbell had been taken off the wall and left sitting on the floor. The SD card had been removed. Someone had come back while we were gone, and we had a very clear idea of who it was. Who else would do that? We called the police again. They told us to make sure all the doors and windows were kept locked. The woman on the phone was upfront with us. She said the removal of the camera could indicate that someone was planning something. That terrified us even more, but at least she was being straight with us. The whistling, the banging, the attempts to re-enter the house, it all continued for weeks. We filed multiple police reports. They never tried our door handle again, and for a while, we let ourselves believe it might finally be over. Then, 3 weeks later, we were lying in bed watching clips from our camera's footage when we switched over to the live feed. That's when we saw him. A man standing outside our garden, wearing a black face mask, hood pulled up, with his arms stretched wide out to his sides, like he was imitating a crucifixion pose. He tilted his head back and stared directly up at our bedroom window. We froze. At that point, we'd moved the camera inside the house, so it wasn't recording. We were so rattled that we didn't even think to screen record in time. He said something, but we couldn't make out the words. Then he turned around, crossed to the opposite side of the street, and stood there, staring at our house for roughly 30 minutes. We called the police again. They told us it wasn't illegal to stand and look at someone's property. They dismissed the whole thing, even when we described what he'd done on our lawn. They made us feel like we were blowing things out of proportion. We didn't sleep properly for days. Every sound from outside put us on edge, even completely ordinary ones. Then, at nearly 3 a.m, we got a notification. I woke my girlfriend and told her I knew someone was out there. She checked the camera, and there they were. 2 masked men coming around the side of our house, shining flashlights through our windows. One of them, the same man who had been tormenting us, appeared to be holding what looked like a crowbar. Why us? What was the purpose of any of this? For days at a time, he'd stand across the street pointing up at our window, waving at us, shouting things we couldn't fully make out. Every time we looked out, he was there with that same blank expression, watching. It was clearly designed to frighten us, and it was working. We kept reporting everything to the police, but they've done very little. The harassment hasn't stopped. We've installed cameras, and we document everything, but we still feel completely powerless. Just earlier today, he was outside again, staring up at us. We captured it on video. We're absolutely terrified, but we'll post an update if anything else happens. Story 2. Let me start by saying I'm not losing my mind. I know exactly how this is going to sound. Paranoid, irrational, completely unhinged. But I swear on everything that every single thing I'm about to tell you is real and actually happened. It began with a face. Or more accurately, with faces. Faces that all looked just slightly wrong. 3 months ago, I ended things with my ex, a guy named Caleb. We'd been together for almost 2 years, and the breakup was a long time coming. Caleb was never physically violent. He never raised a hand to me. But he was controlling and possessive in the most quiet and calculated way imaginable. And honestly, that kind might be the most dangerous kind. He'd monitor when I was on my phone, and then question me about my day later, checking whether my answers matched up the second time around. After I left him, I changed my number, shut down all my social media, and even moved to a new apartment. I genuinely believed I was finally free. Then came the barista. It was a Tuesday morning. I stopped into this small, low-key coffee shop near my new place, somewhere I'd only been a couple of times before. As I stepped up to the counter, the barista, a young woman about my age, smiled and said, "Good morning, sunshine." I went completely still. That was Caleb's name for me. Not some generic sweet nickname. It was his specific thing, and he used it sarcastically. Whenever I was upset, he'd look at me and say, "What's wrong, sunshine?" He liked pressing people's buttons. I told myself it was a coincidence and let it go. But then it happened again. A few days later, I took a rideshare to work. A different driver than usual. An older man, probably in his 50s. He kept glancing at me through the rearview mirror like he was trying to place me. Then he asked, as casually as if he were commenting on the weather, "You ever figure out what you're running from?" I said, "What?" He just laughed quietly and shook his head, like we were sharing some private joke. Caleb said those exact words to me once. After I told him I needed space to figure out who I was, he leaned in close and said, "You ever figure out what you're running from?" And now 2 complete strangers had repeated his words back to me, word for word. It kept happening after that. A woman in a grocery store bumped into me and whispered, "You don't get to just disappear." A man walking past me on the street said, "Still wearing your hair like that," without even breaking his stride. A colleague in my building started humming a tune, the exact song Caleb used to put on whenever we were in the middle of a fight. It wasn't just the words that got to me. It was the way all of these people looked at me, like they already knew me, or at least thought they did. Different faces, completely different people, but their eyes all carried the same knowing expression. I began questioning my own sanity. What other explanation could there possibly be? So I did something I wasn't particularly proud of. I reached out to Caleb, not directly, but through his sister. I told her to pass along a message. Whatever he was doing needed to stop. I figured he'd hired someone, a private investigator maybe, or had somehow been feeding people information about me. I just wanted it to end. She replied the next day. She said she had no idea what I was talking about, and that Caleb was in rehab. He'd been there for 6 weeks, with no access to a phone. I didn't believe her. I thought she was covering for him. That was until she posted a photo of him on Facebook a week later. He looked pale, hollowed out, and was holding one of those one-day sobriety chips. So it couldn't be Caleb, at least not directly. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that these strangers knew things they had absolutely no business knowing. One night I stayed late at work because I didn't want to go home. My apartment had stopped feeling like a safe place. Not because anything bad had happened inside it, but because being alone there felt unbearable. Around 10 o'clock, I finally packed up and made my way back. I walked the 10 minutes home with my head down and my headphones in, but with no music playing. A habit I'd picked up so I could still hear if someone was behind me. When I turned the corner onto my street, there was a young man sitting on the front steps of the building across from mine. His hood was up, and his head was down. I almost walked straight past him until he spoke. "Cold one tonight, hot sunshine." I stopped moving. He didn't look up. He just kept staring at the ground like there was something written on it. I walked past slowly without saying a single word. Once I got to my building, I went upstairs and locked every bolt on my door. I sat on the couch for hours in total silence, just listening to nothing. Eventually, I drifted off. The next morning, I woke up and found my doormat had been flipped over. That might not sound like much, but I live alone, and my unit is on the top floor. You want, but I'll still recognize you. You want, but I'll still recognize you. I didn't fully understand what it meant, but I threw up immediately after reading it. That same day, I booked a hotel room for the weekend. I left my apartment without a single bag. I didn't feel safe enough to stay long enough to pack. I just needed to be somewhere with other people around. The hotel clerk put me on the 4th floor. The room was small and a little stuffy, but for the first time in a while, I felt like I could breathe. That feeling lasted until around 2 in the morning, when someone knocked on my door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I sat up and waited. They knocked again. I crept to the peephole. A woman, maybe in her 40s, was standing there. Her face was completely blank. She was staring directly at the door without expression, without movement, without saying a single word. I didn't make a sound. And eventually, she walked away. It was one of the most disturbing things I have ever experienced. The next morning, I went to the front desk and asked whether anyone had come up to my room. They told me no one should have had access to that floor, especially at that time of night. Every other room on that floor was vacant. That was the moment it clicked. These weren't random, unconnected people. They were being directed. Someone was feeding them details about me, specific phrases, specific memories, things only Caleb would know. But if it wasn't Caleb pulling the strings directly, then who and why? I thought back to something he'd mentioned months before the breakup, a forum he was part of. He described it as a place where people shared advice and strategies. He framed it like some kind of self-improvement or productivity community. He never gave me the name. At the time, I didn't give it a second thought. But looking back now, it sounded like some twisted, cult-like operation where people played psychological games with other people's lives. Except this wasn't a game. This was happening to me. Someone, almost certainly Caleb, had paid or recruited people to repeat his words, mimic his patterns, and make sure that even though he was technically out of my life, I would never stop thinking about him. It wasn't traditional stalking. It was something different, something more insidious. He was embedding himself into strangers so that I could never be sure who I was actually looking at. It wasn't about watching me. It was about making sure I never stopped watching for him. I moved again, deleted every account, even dyed my hair. I told the few friends I trusted not to share my whereabouts with anyone. For a while, it seemed to work. Then last week, I was walking home from the bookstore. A woman passed me on the street and said without slowing down, without even glancing back, "Still hiding behind books, sunshine?" She just kept walking. I don't think this is ever going to stop. Maybe he paid some underground service to do this for a fixed period of time. Maybe he shared my information so widely that it's completely out of his control now. Maybe this has turned into some kind of sick underground game. Who can get closest to Sunshine without actually touching her? Who can scare her the best? I can't trust a stranger's face anymore. The constant, unrelenting paranoia is eating me alive. Story 3. My family are real homebodies. We don't travel. We never have. So when my aunt suggested a group trip to one of Michigan's Great Lakes, everyone was genuinely surprised. But we agreed. We wanted to do something together, to create some new shared memories. My cousin handled the booking and somehow found an Airbnb spacious enough to fit all 18 of us, which felt like nothing short of a miracle given what we paid. The house was right on the beach, with sweeping lake views that stretched so far it almost looked like the ocean. Most of us claimed rooms in the main house, but because of the size of our group, a few of us were placed in a second building directly behind it. A 2-story detached garage with bedrooms on the upper floor. My 3 cousins and I were the ones assigned out there. At first, none of us thought too much about it. We spent most of the first day making the most of things, soaking in the hot tub, lounging on the beach, taking in the views. It genuinely felt like a great start to the trip. It wasn't until night that we actually went into the garage and got a proper look at the place. It was outdated and poorly maintained. The bathroom was carpeted and smelled like mold. The bedding was stained. The door latch was barely functional. Clearly, whoever cleaned the property focused entirely on the main house and left the garage to fend for itself. My cousins refused to sleep on the beds as they were, so I suggested we run the sheets through the washing machine first. The problem was the machines were small. We could only do 1 set at a time, which meant we were going to be up late. We settled upstairs to pass the time while we waited for each cycle. My cousin Maria was complaining about how we'd ended up with the short end of the stick when a feeling started to creep over me. Not anxiety exactly, but something more specific. A heavy, instinctive kind of dread that I've experienced a handful of times before. It's the kind of feeling that usually precedes something going seriously wrong. I told my cousins to stay alert. They took me seriously, especially because we'd all lived through a break-in together back when we were living in Detroit. We knew what it felt like when something wasn't right. Around midnight, the buzzer from the first floor went off. The wash cycle was finished. I went downstairs alone, moved the sheets to the dryer, and brought the fresh-smelling ones back upstairs. When my cousins saw how clean they came out, they wanted their bedding done too. So I kept making trips up and down between cycles, running everyone's sheets. By 2:30 in the morning, we were finally done. We made all the beds and collapsed into them, completely worn out. My cousin Nikki insisted we leave a lamp on, and while the others fell asleep almost immediately, I stayed up a little longer, doing some reading on my phone. I've always been a light sleeper, a habit that started after the break-in. And even when I'm half asleep, I tend to stay aware of what's going on around me. At around 3 in the morning, something slammed into the garage door so hard, it felt like someone had thrown their entire body against it. I shot upright. My cousins didn't move. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, but the impact was far too heavy for that. I stayed quiet and attempted to settle back down. And then it happened again. The same deafening crash, this time violent enough to shake the door in its frame. The whole building shuddered from the force of it. I was wide awake now, watching the lamp-lit room while my cousins slept on undisturbed. No animal could do that. No gust of wind either. 20 minutes later, it happened a third time. The garage shook again, and this time, 2 of my cousins jolted upright. I asked if they'd heard it. Nikki asked what on earth that was. I told her it was the third time it had happened. We all agreed no natural force could produce that kind of sound and impact. Nikki suggested texting her mom, my aunt, so she did. It was just after 4 in the morning when my aunt replied, clearly realizing something serious was going on. She woke my uncle, who immediately went outside to check the property. We stayed upstairs, too afraid to move a muscle, until we heard knocking from below. It was my uncle at the door. When we opened it, he was standing there alongside my dad and several of our older male cousins. That's the moment I knew this was real. He told us to grab our things. We were moving to the main house. Then he told us there had been someone on the property. My heart dropped. I threw everything I had into my suitcase, and we all rushed out of the garage together. Once we were inside the main house, most of the family had been woken up by the noise and commotion. We gathered in the living room and tried to piece together what had happened. I described the first 2 crashes. My cousins confirmed the third. My aunt then told us what had happened after she'd followed my uncle outside. He had spotted someone standing behind the garage and shouted at them. At that exact moment, the door to the main house slammed shut behind her, with enough force that it suggested someone had pulled it. But there was no wind. Fearing that someone may have slipped inside, she ran to wake the others. After a thorough search, no one was found inside the house. Then my uncle described what he had seen. A man was standing behind the garage, not crouching, not running, not hiding, just standing there, staring, almost like he wanted to be spotted. When my uncle called out to him, the man didn't flinch, didn't react. He simply turned around and walked away, but not into the darkness. He seemed to vanish entirely. No sound of footsteps on the leaves. No crunching of the ground beneath him. Nothing. My uncle is not someone given to exaggeration. He's grounded, rational, and serious-minded. That's precisely what made it so frightening. Then my brothers mentioned something else. They had found 2 jester cards, one in the main house and one in the garage. The one in the garage was twisted and grotesque looking. One of my cousins pointed out that jesters are traditionally symbols of mockery and ridicule. The crashes had happened around 3 in the morning, the time some call the devil's hour. Of my cousins had driven down the road during the incident, trying to catch anyone fleeing the scene. He found no one. Nobody went back to the garage that day. We squeezed ourselves into every available space in the main house, floors, couches, anywhere we could find room. My mom gave up her own bed so we could have somewhere comfortable to sleep. On the second night, she was lying on the couch near the large windows facing the water. She woke up around 4 in the morning to the sound of footsteps on the porch. She didn't dare open her eyes, terrified of what she might see looking back at her through the glass. Then she heard someone trying the handle of the basement door. The lock on it was flimsy at best. and several of my brothers and male cousins were asleep down there. The door rattled as someone tried to force it open. My mom rushed to the beachside entrance, but by the time she got there, no one was outside. Every one of the boys was still sound asleep, completely undisturbed. That was our last night. We had planned to stay through Tuesday. We left Monday. On the drive home, none of us could stop talking about it all. When my mom found out I had been going downstairs alone during the laundry cycles, she put forward a theory that sent chills through me. She suggested that whoever was out there may have been watching through that time and assumed I was in the garage by myself. The timing between my last trip downstairs and when we turned in for the night lined up far too neatly with when the banging started. Theories started circulating among the family. Some of us thought it might be a local neighbor trying to drive away yet another group of Airbnb guests. Others felt strongly that something paranormal was at play, especially given the jester cards. My aunt made a point that stuck with everyone. A person with ordinary intentions would have run the moment my uncle spotted them. This man didn't run. He stared, and then he simply ceased to exist. We reached out to the Airbnb host and told her what happened. She claimed she'd checked the footage from the camera mounted above the garage door. We never heard back from her, which made us wonder, did she know who that man was? Was he a neighbor of hers? When we had first arrived, my sister and cousin had walked down to the beach and passed a woman from the house next door. She stared at them with cold, unfriendly eyes. No wave, no greeting, just that flat, hostile gaze. We understood, to some extent, how a steady stream of holiday guests could wear on someone living nearby. But we were respectful. We kept to ourselves. We didn't deserve what happened. This was our first family trip in years, and despite everything that occurred, we genuinely hope it won't be our last.